This is World History, Chapter 1, Renaissance and Reformation. Discussion number 2, the Italian Renaissance. Make sure you note this in your notes, please.
The wealthiest city or group of people that we see during this time period were called the Medicis. This family were essentially as rich as Bill Gates or better during their time period. They sponsored whole different groups of artists and poets and scientists and philosophers just to think up of anything that they could possibly think of in order to increase the knowledge of the Italian people. Uh, we're going to see some of the people that they sponsored by commissioning works of art. Petrarch is one that it's not necessarily going to be in your notes, but Petrarch was one of the foremost librarians of his time period. And what he did that was so important was that he had gathered all of these ancient writings that have been scattered that no one bothered to read during the Dark Ages. But they were sitting in libraries or sitting in caves or even in the Middle East where a lot of these things had been preserved. Petrarch was able to gather them. And one of the things that's going to be advantageous about having things written down is that they're preserved. The preserved thought carries on to the next generation. And what we're going to see is that all these preserved thoughts and preserved ideas from ancient time are going to have a profound influence on the thought of the early Renaissance and the idea of humanism. Um, One of the ways that the Medicis made a whole bunch of money was not just buying and selling of things that were coming into Italy from the Far East, but also in the idea of exchanging currencies. All the different towns in Italy and all the different towns in Europe all had their own version of money. It's real easy right now in the United States. When you go to Maryland, you can still use the same money you have in Pennsylvania. But if you did not have U.S. currency and you got paid in Pennsylvania money and you decided to go down to the Hagerstown Mall, you'd be sunk unless you could find someone who had a bunch of the money who would be willing to exchange it for you. And of course, they do it for a service charge. That's how the Medicis made a huge amount of their money, was doing this currency exchange. Now, what did they get from Greek thought? What did they get from the Roman ideas that was preserved in these writings and the thinking that they were going through? Well, they had this idea of humanism, the idea that humans are worth idea of studying. Because remember, the Dark Ages was it's all about God, and that's good, but you don't really have a profound understanding of what human is unless you understand what God is. That's a difference. And one of the ideas of the Renaissance was that they believed with humanism that it would be perfect to have a perfect man. If you did things the right way, you could create that humanity could live perfectly. And that was their goal, was to find this way to live perfectly, to depict humans perfectly. And so what we're going to see here is some ideas of how men could live perfectly and be shown perfectly. The idea of perspective. As you go on to the Leonardo da Vinci slide, you see the idea of perspective showing that there's depth in the painting, that the wall is actually significantly behind the disciples in the painting of the Last Supper. And how to depict humanity in human form from the Last Supper. Of course, Michelangelo and his ideas of architecture and especially sculpting the David, which is considered by many to be the most perfect depiction of the human form. Um, if you go on to the next slide, you see what is a picture of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel that was painted by Michelangelo over several years. If you look carefully at some of the paintings that you see, especially across the center part of that picture, you'll notice that these have been paintings that you have been seeing individually for years, but but you didn't really maybe know that they are all in one painting on the ceiling. So this shows us a lot of the artists of the Italian Renaissance. One other person I want to make sure I bring to your attention before we close it off for the day is Machiavelli, who wrote the book The Prince, which was considered to be the first political science book showing how to maintain your power over those that are under you in the way of a lord or a baron or things of that nature.
That is the end of World History, Chapter 1, Discussion Number 2, Italian Renaissance.